acutely aware of place. And where we are now, West 86th Street on the Upper West Side, was once next door to Seneca Village, home to freed Blacks and immigrant Irish before being claimed by eminent domain and buried in 1857 in the making of Central Park. And before that, it was the Mannahatta of Lenape-Hoking, ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape people, for whom it so remains. Or in the words of the poet Campbell McGrath, acorns, tossing them into the Hudson River from a bench, as I did when I was Peter Stuyvesant, when I was Walt Whitman, when we were of the Lenape and Broadway our hunting trail. Then the deer vanished, the docks decayed, the towers fell. The African graveyard was buried beneath concrete, as the memory of slavery has been obscured by metonymy and willful amnesia. The poem from which these lines come, The Ruins of Yankee Stadium, proudly I say it was commissioned by the BGC for one of its publications before being published in the New Yorker, points towards the passage of time, and time, as the French novelist Marguerite Yourcenar writes, and as every conservator everywhere knows, is the mighty sculptor. Almost 10 years ago, the project that we are bringing to a conclusion now, Cultures of Conservation, was launched into public life in this room. I want today to recognize and acknowledge with gratitude for their visionary support, Mariette Westermann and Allison Gilchrist, who were respectively at the time Vice President and Associate Program Officer for Art History, Conservation, and Museums at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. At that meeting, Naveen Piplani, who is with us this morning, told a story that was so compelling that it stayed in the minds of those of us from the BGC who were there, and it became a kind of touchstone in our conversations over the next 10 years, returning from time to time and providing ultimately part of the motivation to do the fuller exploration that we are here assembled to do. Naveen told the story about the most recent restoration of the Taj Mahal, in which to guarantee authentic practice, referring to the 17th century way of making the structure, rather than doing the kind of scientific technical analysis that might precede such a project in New York or London, the organizers contracted the stonemasons who were the descendants of those who built the Taj Mahal, so that the practices of the 17th century, which had been passed from generation to generation, would be available for use in the 21st century. And that story, with its very different view of what constitutes authenticity and historical practice, made us want to know more about the way conservation was thought about and worked in India. Like the story of the Ise Shrine in Japan, which I spoke about yesterday, this story stood for us as a startling intellectual provocation, suggesting a world with distinctive ways of thinking about conservation, with much for us to contemplate. When talking about the Ise Shrine yesterday, I quoted from Christopher Wood's 2016 book, Forgery, Fiction, Replica, which describes a pre-Renaissance Europe. He would have us think of it as pre-modern, governed by what he calls the logic of substitution. An artifact, he writes, and I quote, took its meaning from its membership within a chain of referential artifacts, stretching back in time to a hidden origin, but not from its absolute place within that chain. Artifacts within such a chain could be substituted for one another without impairment of reference. I noted yesterday how this resonated with the logic of the Ise Shrine's regular renewal as an ancient, authentic structure. But for our purposes today, we would be advised to read on in Wood, for he gives a different example, and I quote, "In presenting this thesis about the European Renaissance to various audiences, I have been struck by how often specialists in the art and architecture of other continents and periods saw parallels in the cultures they know. A wooden temple in southern India, it was explained to me, is very likely to be described by a local authority as ancient, even when the same describer is well aware that the actual timber and carvings at hand were cut and carved only recently in living memory." He concludes, "Such parallels across cultures are risky, and I will not pursue them." we have a greater risk tolerance here. And that pursuit across cultures is, in fact, something that these 2 days are about. And let me say why we're doing that, why we think it's worth taking that risk. Because in the comparative framework of an interdisciplinary institute with a global mandate, and moreover, one anchored in the study of objects, which always necessitate comparison, since objects themselves are shy and need some coaxing to talk, we are always comparing. And second, because we are therefore aware that one never compares in order to obtain ironclad answers. One compares in order to obtain, and maybe find is more precise. One compares in order to find better questions. And that, of course, is what we are doing with the project of these 2 days, but also with the larger one of cultures of conservation. There are certainly some obvious parallels or connections between Japan and India, even if this is not the usual comparison of Japan with Korea or Japan with China. For instance, the role of cultural property law in both India and Japan, the role of Buddhism, the importance of craft and craftspeople in their respective cultures of conservation. But these are only a few obvious ones that come to mind, and it is exciting to think about what other thoughts the day may spark. I want to end, as I did yesterday, by thanking my colleagues who ran the different working groups in this project and then served as the curatorial committee for the making of the concluding exhibition, Conserving Active Matter, on view just down the street in the BGC galleries until July 10th. Ivan Gaskell, Aaron Glass, Meredith Lynn, Jennifer Maas, Itai Weinrib, and a special congratulations to Sun Kai Po, lead curator of Conserving Active Matter, and Andrew W. Mellon Fellow these past 3 years. I also want to extend my and the institution's profound thanks to the people who actually organized and made today possible. Laura Minsky, Associate Director of Public Humanities Plus Research, and Jen Ha, Assistant Director of Research Programs, for all of their careful work, both before and on the day. Jocelyn Lau, our impeccable designer, for the materials in our hands, and Maggie Walter for those on our screens. I also want to thank the people who physically create and prepare the space in which we work and eat and have been these past few days. James Congregan, Head of Buildings and Facilities, Ken Yi Sun, Facilities Operations Manager, Jose Oliveira, Facilities Coordinator, and Enrique Angeles, Ivan Ospina, K.R. Patterson, Ravichan Monaram, Charles Watt, and Gilberto Rivera. My deepest thanks to all of them.